I've always believed that silence was my greatest strength. I could endure more than most. Long shifts, cold shoulders, empty bank accounts, and even emptier hearts. But nothing in my life had prepared me for what I was about to face at. That reunion. The sun was barely up, casting a pale glow over the kitchen as I poured myself a cup of stale coffee. It was the only thing in my fridge besides half a carton of milk and a few eggs. I leaned against the counter, feeling the sting of exhaustion settle in my bones. My back ached from hours of kneading dough at the bakery, but I didn't mind the physical pain. I could handle that. It was the emotional weight that never seemed to lift. "Mom, have you seen my blue sneakers?" Max's voice broke the silence, and I turned to see my 9-year-old son standing in the hallway, one sock on, his hair sticking out in every direction. I smiled, the kind of smile that softened the edges of my worn face. "Check under the couch, sweetheart. They always end up there." As he darted off, I took a deep breath and let my eyes drift to the envelope on the kitchen table. It was thick, cream-colored, with bold cursive letters. The Whitmore Family Reunion. Formal invitation. My stomach twisted at the sight of it. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it was. The Whitmores were my former in-laws, old money, old values, and a long history of judging people like me. I had been married to their son, Brandon Whitmore, for 8 years before I discovered he was cheating on me with my younger sister, Haley. The betrayal had gutted me, but I'd kept my head down, packed my bags, and left with Max, never looking back. They had taken Brandon's side, of course. To them, I was just Emily Dawson, the girl from the wrong side of town who'd never truly belonged. A bakery worker. A nobody. And now, 3 years later, they were inviting me back. Not out of love, but out of obligation. I had every intention of throwing that invitation in the trash. But that night, as I was tucking Max into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, hopeful eyes and asked, "Mom, are we going to Grandma and Grandpa Whitmore's reunion?" I froze. "Why do you ask, honey?" He hesitated. "Because I miss them. And Dad. I want to see them again. Just for a little while." My heart clenched. Brandon hadn't visited Max in over a year, hadn't even sent a birthday card. But Max still remembered the good times, the bedtime stories, the soccer games, and I couldn't take that away from him. So I lied. "Okay," I said softly, brushing a hand through his hair. "We'll go." In the days that followed, I tried not to second-guess myself. I told myself it would just be one afternoon. We'd show up, smile, make Max happy, and leave. I could endure a few hours of whispers and stares for my son, but down, I had a gnawing feeling, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The morning of the reunion, I woke early to iron Max's shirt and press my only decent dress. A navy blue one I'd bought years ago for a job interview I didn't get. I kept my makeup simple, just enough to cover the fatigue under my eyes, and pulled my hair into a neat bun, no frills, no flash. I didn't want to stand out. As we stepped outside, Max holding my hand tightly, I forced myself to smile. "You ready for this, champ?" He nodded eagerly. "Do you think Grandma will have those chocolate chip cookies again?" I laughed softly. "I'm sure she will." We drove in silence, the city giving way to suburbs, then to the sprawling estates of West Haven Hills, where the Whitmore family lived. Their mansion loomed ahead like something out of a magazine. White pillars, manicured lawns, and a circular driveway filled with sleek cars. As we walked up the steps, I felt eyes on us. Distant relatives, I barely remembered, all dressed to the nines, clutching champagne glasses and exchanging gossip like currency. At the entrance, Margaret Whitmore, my former mother-in-law, greeted guests with air kisses and polite smiles. When she saw me, her smile faltered, then returned, thinner this time. "Well, Emily," she said, her voice sharp beneath the sweetness. "You actually came. I held Max's hand tighter. We were invited. She looked at Max and nodded, her eyes cold. Yes, of course. Come in. The main hall was grander than I remembered. High ceilings, chandeliers, and the kind of opulence that made me feel small. A staff member guided us to a table in the far corner, away from the main crowd. I tried to ignore it, but when I saw the nameplates, my breath caught. Mine read, Emily Dawson, single mother, bakery worker. Max's, Max Dawson, son of Emily. Father, unknown. I stared at the cards, unable to move. Max looked up at me, confusion in his eyes. What does that mean, Mom? I knelt down to him, forcing a smile I didn't feel. It's just a silly mistake, don't worry about it. But inside, my chest was burning. We sat down quietly, trying to fade into the background, but I could feel the stares, hear the hushed whispers. I knew this world had never wanted me, but I hadn't expected them to make it so painfully clear. As laughter echoed through the hall and glasses clinked, I wondered why I had come at all. Then I remembered Max's face that night. The hope. The innocence. I came for him. I just didn't know at that moment that he would end up being the one who stood up. Not just for himself, but for me. And when he did, everything would change. As I sat there, trying to shrink into my seat, I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. The noise of the reunion seemed to blur around me. The clatter of silverware, the bursts of laughter, the clinking of wine glasses. But I only heard one thing clearly. The deafening silence between me and the rest of the room. Max was fidgeting beside me, his small fingers running along the edge of his name card. I wanted to tear it up, to grab his hand and run out of that mansion, back to our little apartment where no one laughed at us, where I didn't feel like an outsider in my own life. But I didn't move. I stayed seated because I didn't want Max to see me give up. From across the room, I saw Haley, my sister, my former best friend, now dressed in an elegant emerald gown, her hand looped through Brandon's arm like they were the king and queen of this grand charade. She noticed me and offered a smile, thin and smug, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. She walked over slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and leaned down just enough for only me to hear. Did you like the seating arrangement? Thought it'd be fitting. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding. Why are you doing this? She straightened up, flicking a strand of hair from her shoulder. It's not personal, Em. You had your chance. Now it's my turn. Before I could respond, Brandon joined her, eyes skimming over me like I was invisible. Glad you could make it, he said, voice flat. Max looked up at him, hopeful. Hi, Dad. Brandon hesitated for a second, just a second, before placing a hand on Max's head. Hey, buddy. It was brief, perfunctory, and then he was gone, leading Haley toward the center of the room where a small stage had been set up. I watched them ascend the steps, Haley gripping the microphone with a glint in her eyes. She tapped it twice, and the room hushed. Family, she began, her voice honeyed. It's such a blessing to have everyone together again. We've missed these reunions, haven't we? Applause rippled across the hall. And today, she continued, I want to take a moment to honor someone very special. Her gaze locked onto me, a slow smile curling on her lips. Emily, would you mind standing? My stomach dropped. I shook my head slightly, but all eyes turned to me. Max squeezed my hand. I stood slowly, every nerve in my body screaming to sit back down. Haley gestured toward me with exaggerated grace. For those of you who don't know, Emily here used to be my sister-in-law. She's a wonderful baker, makes the best muffins in town. And today we're lucky to have her here, joining us, despite her busy schedule. Laughter trickled through the crowd. And since she's such a pro in the kitchen, Haley continued, how about helping us serve dessert later? One last sweet treat for old time's sake? I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. I could feel the humiliation washing over me, wave after wave, each word a blade slicing deeper. Before I could speak, Margaret Whitmore, ever the grand matriarch, chimed in from her table. "Oh yes, Emily, that would be delightful. You've always had a way with pastries, and people like you belong in service." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. People like me. I sat down slowly, my legs barely supporting me, as laughter filled the room again. Max looked up at me, his brows furrowed, his eyes confused and hurt. "Why are they being mean, Mom?" he whispered. I swallowed hard. "It's just a joke, honey. Don't worry." But the truth was, I was breaking. Right there, under the chandeliers, surrounded by people who had once called me family, I was breaking. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to take a moment to connect with you, the person watching this right now. Yes, you. Where are you watching from? Drop the flag of your country in the comments. I'd love to see where all of you amazing people are tuning in from. And I know, maybe you're watching this video alone, in your room, on your phone or laptop, just trying to escape for a little while. I want you to know, you're not alone. Right now, I'm here with you, sharing this story. And that connection, it means the world to me. What happened next would change everything, because just when I thought I couldn't take any more, Max let go of my hand. And with a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, calm, determined, he stood up. And that was the moment the room began to fall apart. Max's chair scraped back against the polished marble floor, the sound sharp and jarring amid the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. At first, no one noticed him, just a small boy, standing at the edge of a world that had tried to exclude him. But then he started walking, slow and steady, toward the stage where Haley and Brandon still basked in their own twisted spotlight. Reached out instinctively. "Max," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "Come back here, sweetheart." But he didn't stop. His little hands were clenched at his sides, his shoulders squared, and his chin tilted upward with a quiet defiance. That made my heart ache. I had no idea what he was about to do, only that something inside him had shifted, and there was no pulling him back. The room began to still as he climbed the steps. Conversations paused. Forks hovered midair. Eyes followed him, confused, curious. A 10-year-old boy walking into the lion's den. Max approached the microphone and looked up at Haley, who stared down at him with an amused smile. "Well, aren't you brave?" she said, laughing lightly. "Did you want to say something, Max?" He nodded once. "Yes." The room hushed. Someone in the back chuckled, but it was cut off by Max's voice, clear, calm, and far too steady for someone his age. "I want to give a gift too," he said. "A gift of truth." Haley blinked, confused. Brandon shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Max was already reaching into his pocket. Time seemed to slow as he pulled out a small silver recording device. My heart dropped into my stomach. I didn't even know he owned one. But then I remembered. The old recorder I used for recipe notes, left in a drawer months ago. He held it up to the microphone and pressed play. At first, just static. Then voices. Low, unmistakable, and damning. Brandon's voice came first, laced with arrogance. "Once we get custody, she won't have anything left, not even Max." Then Haley. "It's perfect. Humiliate her at the reunion, make her look unstable, she'll back off. And when my name's on the bakery lease instead of hers, she won't have a leg to stand on." The room erupted in gasps. My vision blurred. I couldn't breathe. Haley's face drained of color, her lips parting in horror. "Turn that off! That's private!" Max didn't flinch. "It's not private when it's about me and my mom." Brandon lunged toward him, but Max stepped back, holding the recorder high, and then came the final blow. Haley's voice again, laughing coldly. "Your parents adore me now. Emily's just old news. A single mom working in a bakery. Who's going to believe her over us? The recording clicked off. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret Whitmore stood slowly from her chair, her face pale as she stared at Haley and Brandon. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Haley opened her mouth, stammering. It's taken out of context." Brandon tried to regain control, stepping forward. "They're just lies. A kid doesn't understand." But Max cut him off. "I understand enough," he said firmly. "You tried to take me from my mom. You tried to hurt her. And you lied to everyone." My legs finally obeyed me. I stood, hands trembling, my heart torn between pride and disbelief. Max looked at me then, not for reassurance, not for approval, just to make sure I was okay. And I was. Because somehow, my son, my little boy, had stood up in front of everyone who ever looked down on us and burned their lies to the ground. The spell shattered. Guests began to murmur, then speak outright. Margaret sat down heavily, shaking her head. A few of Brandon's cousins stood and walked out, casting disgusted looks back at him and Haley. The carefully crafted image of the Whitmore family, pristine and untouchable, was crumbling like sand, beneath a tide. Brandon turned to me, desperation now in his eyes. "Emily, you don't have to. Let's talk about this." I didn't answer him. I walked toward Max, climbed the steps, and knelt beside him. I took the recorder from his hand and set it on the podium, then wrapped him in my arms. "You were so brave," I whispered. "I'm so proud of you." He clung to me, shaking slightly, but he nodded. Haley stood frozen, mascara streaking down her cheeks, while Brandon stared at the ground, silent. Whatever power they thought they had, it was gone now. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The air outside the Whitmore estate was cooler than I remembered, crisp and sharp against my skin as I held Max's hand and walked away from the chaos we had left behind. The distant hum of voices still echoed from the hall, but it no longer mattered. I had spent years shrinking myself to survive that family, letting them dictate how I should feel, how much I was worth, who I was allowed to be. Not anymore. Max looked up at me as we reached the car, his eyes searching mine. Did I do something bad? I stopped, kneeling to meet him eye to eye, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. No, baby. You did something right. You stood up for the truth. You stood up for me. That's never bad. He nodded slowly, the weight of everything finally sinking in. I buckled him into his seat, my heart heavy but full. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled with words, just presence and peace. That night, after Max fell asleep curled against my side, I stared at the ceiling, wondering what would come next. I wasn't naive. I knew Brandon and Haley wouldn't let this go easily. Their masks had been ripped off, and people like them didn't handle shame well. But I wasn't afraid. Something had changed, not just in them, but in me. In the days that followed, the news of what happened at the reunion spread fast. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into consequences. Haley lost a major contract with a catering company that had been funding her event planning startup. Brandon, desperate to maintain control, tried to deny everything. But the recording Max had played was undeniable. He tried to reach out to me, emails, texts, even showing up at my work one afternoon. I made a mistake, he said, standing by the bakery counter, looking more like a shadow of himself than the man I once loved. I want to make things right. I stood tall, flour on my hands, apron dusted from a long morning of baking. You don't get to rewrite the story, Brandon. Max and we're fine without you. We have been for a long time. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He knew he had no ground left to stand on. Margaret sent a letter weeks later, a carefully worded apology about family and misunderstandings, thinly veiled attempts to salvage dignity. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on what mattered. Max Us, the bakery's owner, Mr. Callahan, offered me a promotion after hearing what happened. "You've got grit, Emily," he told me, patting my shoulder. "People like you deserve more." I accepted the position of co-manager, and for the first time, I allowed myself to dream bigger. I started taking night classes in business, just 2 a week, nothing crazy. But it felt like the start of something real. Something mine. One evening, as Max and I walked home under a sky splashed with stars, he squeezed my hand and asked, "Do you think we'll ever have our own house?" I looked down at him, smiling. "Yeah, I do. One step at a time." 3. Months later, we moved into a small townhouse on the edge of town. Modest, but ours. Max painted his room blue and hung drawings of superheroes on the walls. I filled the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh bread. We laughed more, slept better, lived freer. I still think about that reunion sometimes. The moment. Max stood up and shattered the lie we'd been forced to live under. He was just a child, but in that moment he became my hero. He reminded me that the truth, even when it's painful, is always more powerful than silence. And as I tucked him into bed one night, he looked at me and said, "We're the strongest team, right, Mom?" I leaned down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "The strongest there is." This story is more than just about betrayal or public humiliation. At its core, it's a story about courage, resilience, and the unconditional love between a mother and her child. When the world turned its back, when lies were wrapped in power and pride, a young boy stood up, not for himself, but for the mother who had given him everything. It's a powerful reminder that truth has the strength to break any chain, and family, the real kind built on love and loyalty, gives us the courage to face anything. Now I want to hear from you. What did you feel while watching this story? If you liked it, comment the number 2 down below. If you didn't like it, that's totally okay. Drop a 7 in the comments. I truly value your thoughts. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me keep sharing meaningful stories with you. Thank you for being here, listening with me. Because in this moment, you're not alone. And that means everything.